All right, so I am going to continue now to talk about the Mexican Revolution, building off the discussion of nationalism that we had. So, as you remember from our oligarchy discussion, Porfirio Diaz is the head of the Mexican state, and he came into power in 1876. So by 1910, he's been president for nearly 3.5 decades, which is crazy if you think about it. By 1910, he's an old man. And the liberals within Mexico want him out. Or at least not out, at least they want some access to greater power. So a guy comes along by the name of Francisco Maduro, and he leads calls for reform. And what he wants to do is he basically wants to increase the access of the middle class toward the elite channels of power. We're not talking about a guy who's a revolutionary, at least not at first. And so he runs for president in 1910 under a promise that essentially he'll help the middle class. In 1910, during that election, Diaz declares himself the winner, and he has Maduro jailed, put in prison. Fortunately, this causes Maduro to radicalize, and what it leads to is he starts calling for the full removal of Diaz and the demands that the land redistribution, among other things. Finally, in 1911, facing pressure from Maduro's supporters, Diaz steps down. And between 1911 and 1913, Maduro serves the president of Mexico. Unfortunately, during this time, beginning with Maduro's imprisonment, there's a large number of uprisings taking place throughout Mexico. The pressure that was sort of building up among the lower classes during the Porfiriato, during the 34 years in which Diaz is president, finally starts to break through the surface. And order begins to break down. There are a series of full armed rebellions throughout Mexico. And this is the beginning of what's known as the Mexican Revolution. Okay, so there are three major movements that we need to worry about in the Mexican Revolution. There are lots of them. There are lots of movements. You just need to focus on three. The first one is under Emiliano Zapata. This is in central and south central Mexico. He's an Amerindian, a mestizo, a landowner, basically a kind of cowboy. He's got this big mustache. Google a picture of him. It's great. He's got a huge mustache, a giant sombrero. He becomes kind of the image of the revolution. And the majority of his support comes from the Amerindian community. At first, he allies with Maduro, but as we'll see a little bit later on, this doesn't work out. The second group is Pancho Villa. He is in northern Mexico. His base of support is not particularly Amerindian, rather, or at least not principally Amerindian. Rather, what you see a lot of the groups that the industrial north depends upon supporting Villa. So who do we see? We see miners, railroad workers, oil workers, as well as some of the cowboys, the vaqueros from the north in addition. And then lastly, you've got the constitutionalists. The constitutionalists are principally urban, mainly middle class, guys like Madero. They are not as revolutionary as Zapata and Villa. Rather, what they want to do is they want to remake the government in a constitutional way so that it better reflects the kind of desires of the revolution. So they wanted to kind of work within the system versus Villa and Zapata, who are willing to seriously act against the government if need be. So the constitutionalists helped push through the 1917 Constitution. This is a major, major document for Mexican history. It does all kinds of things to help the Mexican people. It nationalizes oil rights, meaning that it recognizes that the right to oil underneath the soil belongs to the Mexican government. Under Diaz, it had belonged entirely to the companies who bought it. It reestablishes the idea of common land, the ejido, that we talked about in the liberalism section, the progress in liberalism, the destruction of communal land, mainly held by Amerindians. It reestablishes the idea of communal land. It also gives a tremendous amount of land to the peasants. I'm talking tens of millions of acres. Huge amounts of land are given to the peasants. Also, it attacks the church's position. Diaz, while liberal in many ways, really left the church in a lot of, principally alone. And so what the 1917 Constitution does is it makes it illegal for the church to even own land. The church has to give land back to the Mexican government. It bans priests from teaching in primary schools, and it even bans priests from wearing ecclesiastical outfits in public. You can't dress like a priest and go out in public. So this is a very strong reaction against the church, reflecting the decades and decades of very close involvement between the church and the Mexican government. Bring you a little bit over here. There we go. Yeah, that might happen. Yeah, it does. Excellent. All right, so with the 1917 Constitution, lots of people are happy. Zapata and Villa are not. They make far more radical demands than the Constitution initially allows. And so what happens is the Mexican government turns on them. They use the Mexican army to fight Villa and Zapata, these men who had up until this point been absolute heroes of the revolution. Inevitably, the government ends up winning. Over time, they established basically a one-party system. The Institutional Revolutionary Party, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the PRI, that actually was in charge of Mexico all the way up until the end of the 20th century. It's not until the elections in the early 2000s that the PRI gets voted out. And then later on they come back. But yeah, so we're talking, give or take, about 7 decades of rule under the PRI. So what are some of the results of all of this instability? Well, number one, public education becomes a serious issue. The Mexican government establishes a vast public education system, one that is explicitly created so as to curb back the powers of the church. Additionally, land distribution. Like I said, if you remember, the amount of land that gets handed back is really pretty extraordinary. If you remember back to the liberalism and progress discussion that we had back in Unit 4, I think, we talked about how Mexican the great landowners, their farms grew and grew and grew as communal land was outlawed. We see a really large amount of undoing of this through the Mexican Revolution. Additionally, there's infrastructure growth. There's an attempt by the Mexican government to connect the rural parts with the cities. The integration of the countryside into the cultural and governmental function of the country. And then lastly, and this is an important one, the celebration of Amerindian and mixed race peoples. A guy named Jose Vasconcelos, he's an education minister, and he writes a book called the pamphlet called The Cosmic Race. In it, he argues that the mestizos are actually superior to the other, quote-unquote, pure peoples. And so basically saying that it is because of this glorious mixing in Mexico that Mexico has such a bright future ahead of it. So the big ideas to take away here. Number one, this issue of church and state. This is the realization of the liberal ideal of the church-state divide. At no point after this does the church ever regain, all the way up until today, does the church ever regain the same position that it had under Diaz after the revolution. The revolution totally changes the relationship between church and state, and it remains that way. And then additionally, race and status. The Mexican Revolution is the first time that the notion of the mestizo being something positive actually becomes state policy. Prior to this, we saw a little bit about of this when we were just talking about as the 19th century moved into the 20th century. It was principally a movement of intellectuals. But now what we see is this is the first time that the idea of celebrating mestizaje, mixing, becomes actual full-on state policy. Obviously, this represents a radical break from what had been policy under people like Juarez, who was himself Amerindian, for example, but perceiving mixed race people as being obstacles to progress. The Mexican Revolution terminates that. There is no more of that in Mexico. Okay, so thank you very much.